you, Don, and kia ora tātou, everybody. Good to be here. Don, please wave at me when I've got a minute to go. As moderator, that would be good. So I'm going to probably get to the second bit, only a tiny bit, but hopefully that will come in the debate, that what the government should be doing here. So the general case around government intervention, you will probably know well about market failure. We have government involved. For instance, the whole concept of limited liability is a construct, isn't it? We have patents, we have copyrights. We know there are externalities and we know there are public goods. We might disagree about how broad they are, but defence is at least one of them. We can also agree that there's pressures always on government to intervene in certain ways. So there's rent-seeking lobbyists. There's some who prefer monopoly, then there's some who, I would say, have got an SME fetish, etc. There's the moral hazard issue that Don referred to. If you always know you'll be rescued, then what are the incentives to price and risk? I think it's a bit like a recent referendum. Should regulation as part of good government intervention be an offence? And of course, I think what makes a difference in referenda is words like good or bad. So if we put it another way, should regulation as part of bad government intervention be an offence, I think that might influence the outcome. And I suspect that if there is a consensus, and I've got to yet to hear my learned speakers following that, it makes sense to have good government intervention, then all that remains is the rather heroic task of us agreeing what good regulation might look like. So the causes of the global financial crisis, some would say, and Don referred to this, global imbalances was an underlying cause. That's this phenomenon, I suppose, if we represent it in two countries, USA and China, where you have overvalued currency, high debt, low savings in one country, and you have undervalued currency, surpluses that are linked to the Feds in the US, and underconsumption in another country. I would argue, coming from the Council of Trade Unions, that there was an insanity that crept into some of the rewards. Hedge fund managers paid 23,000 times the average wage. The average pay in the top 50 Wall Street banks averaged 590 million, etc. There was also this sense that I read a lot of things where people say no one could have predicted, and of course there's a few people around who say, hey, I did, you know, and they're pretty popular people at the moment. Of course, predicting what's going to happen next is also quite hard. But when we see mathematical models that kind of come out of universities and came into the derivatives and the financial markets and said there's a 1 million chance of Lehman's failing, you have to wonder. So I think people could have predicted, and if you looked at it more about behavioural finance, where you accept these things about herd behaviour, irrational exuberance, etc., you'd have a much more human analysis of how markets operate rather than some of the mathematical models that we're operating. And of course there are different views, and Don referred to this. Greenspan argued that the exploding trade in derivatives was a benign way of hedging against risk. Clearly there's lobbies that go on here. If you look at in the US at the Commodity Futures Modernisation Act, you know, you see that derivatives weren't covered by that. That was not an accident. People lobbied to make sure they were not covered by it. The whole issue of voluntary regulation of investment banks at the SEC. So there are different causes. Don's referred to one about interest rates being held too low for too long. People being encouraged to lend in subprime. The Community Reinvestment Act, which I've had a look at, and I don't think is too bad on paper, but there's no doubt that there was an encouragement to lend, almost loan shark behaviour is the way you have to characterise it, lending to people who are the most high risk, so there's high risk, so you get a high return, but there's a high risk of failure in terms of the subprime. So I guess some of the things that I would put my finger on, and I draw on people unashamedly, like Krugman, Wade, people like that, so you know where I'm coming from. The Securities Exchange Commission 2004 allowing leverage of 1 to 33 when the trend would be more like 1 to 12. That's an issue, it seems to me. It's fine to have $1 to pay back 33 people $1 when you're making $5 or $6 a year, but when you start losing it does get a bit tough, doesn't it? to find the $33 when you've only got one. So the whole separation between initiation and ultimate ownership of mortgages, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which deliberately post-depression separated bank types, that was repealed in 1999. The whole failure of financial regulation that occurred, the whole process of allowing the securitisation, and one can understand it. I mean, I've tried to kind of understand what happened with Bernard. You probably know a lot more about this, but I can kind of understand that if you've got something that's toxic debt and you mix it with something, you know, so that's subprime, and something called Alte, which is a bit less, you know, you don't even know what's happening there. These ones, you know, they can't afford to pay. This one, you don't even know what's happening. And a bit of prime in there, a bit of industrial stuff out of Brazil. It does sound like a way of actually trying to hedge against risk, doesn't it? But if it gets so big, it's so toxic, then you're actually spreading risk. Anyway, I look forward to what others have got to say on that. But it's always seemed to me to be, you know, a very difficult scenario where you've got these rating agencies that got involved and saying, okay, that's one way through the securitisation process, something can go from toxic to highly rated and then people buy into it. And I guess some people might see the rating agencies as a proxy for more general risk, but it appears they were given a role that was really seen as representation, fair representation of market value, and you have to say they failed in that role. So, the need for a government response. I think there's limits around monetary policy when you get up against a zero lower bound, which last happened in the Depression. There's issues around nationalisation that have been put up. There's some who have been arguing that banks are really a public good, should be underwritten totally or nationalised. I think a lot of the people I mix with say if something's too big to fail, isn't it big enough to regulate or even own? I think also the issue from our perspective in the trade union movement is this whole process of financialisation in manufacturing firms found that 25% between a year and 15% gets to become a finance company as well as a manufacturer. That meant the whole issue around contagion really got changed. One of the questions I have is a very human question, I think. How we have a regulation that can keep up with rapid change? So credit default stock went from 0 to $62 trillion in 7 years. Now, I don't know how long it took on, but I think it would have taken a good part of 6 or 7 years, wouldn't it? So it does seem to me that you get left with another scenario, which is that human beings somehow have to supervise and say, oh, this financial product or this financial market innovation is good, and that's good. Or on the other hand, they're going to say, actually that carries systemic financial risk with it, so it's bad. And it seems to me it's not so much about regulation, it's actually about supervision. And I think that's what some of the debate has moved into. There's other things I've read about disallowing off-balance items, etc. Now, moving into more ideological territory, with a lot of my colleagues I've found that, you know, when the Berlin Wall collapsed and the Soviet Union model of communism disappeared, there were some pure Marxists who held on, well, no, we don't allow our analysis of the world and what's wrong with capitalism to be dented by these real-world examples of failure. And I do feel there's a little bit like that happening on the neoliberal right with respect, Don. You say, you know, this is all collapsed around us, but no, the model is still fine, it's just there was some bad regulation there. And I remember Rod Dean, post-Enron, giving a talk at Treasury where he said, oh no, don't intervene. And look, I know there's some people that say that the financial reporting standards, I'm getting close, financial reporting standards have actually forced companies to put a realised value that is much lower than would be the case because they're not going to realise it. But he really argued that the high moral standards of boards would see us through. And I think that was patently wrong. So I've run out of time. I'm not so fussed about the bonuses to be offered. I mean, I think that's a kind of moral case, and I think people are accountable, but I do think that's a rather petty approach to what is a big financial problem, to just go after the bonuses of CEOs as if that's going to really solve the problems. Stimulus, I think Australia's done more, even if we divide by 5, population, 7, GDP. Our stimulus was 90% around tax cuts, 2/3 of which were Labor abandoned. And I think the evidence is there that we're reliant on government intervention and stimulus elsewhere to help get us out of this, that we're being protected somewhat because of good regulation by government in part, and thirdly that government is actually investing and intervening through infrastructure, home installation, job support scheme, etc. Thank you.